On a bench in Dandong, a city on China's border with North Korea, sits a watch movement called the PAX 9611, 196 components. 4 mainspring barrels coupled together, a tourbillon turning at the center of the dial, 120 hours of running time from a single wind. The factory that builds it has been in that city since the late 1950s. Locals call Dandong the Geneva of the East. That watch sells for $3,999. The cheapest tourbillon Switzerland has ever brought to market, Tag Heuer's Carrera Heuer 02T, priced deliberately to undercut the entire industry, launched at 14,900 Swiss francs. In 2025, Switzerland exported 14.6 million watches. China exported roughly 589 million, about 40 Chinese watches leaving the country for every Swiss one. And Swiss exports to mainland China fell 25.8% in 2024, then another 12.1% in 2025. The Swiss watch industry did not lose a price war. Nobody was fighting one. And what is collapsing is not really the watches. It is the ability of a small number of companies to decide how many of them existed, an ability that was never Swiss engineering in the first place. It was a supply agreement. So how does a steel sports watch go from 5 times its list price to half of what it was worth in about 36 months? Why did the fall begin in the same year Chinese buyers stopped showing up? And what were those buyers doing while they were gone? By the end of this video, you'll understand what you were actually paying for when you paid a premium for a Swiss watch. And you'll see that the premium was never inside the watch. None of this is hidden. It is in the export statistics the Federation of the Swiss Watch Industry publishes every January. It is in the 9th annual Morgan Stanley and Lux Consult report on the Swiss industry, published in February 2026. It is in a Swiss Competition Commission decision dated the 15th of July 2020 in the results of a prize ceremony held in Geneva in November 2025 and in a court file in Milan. It has just never been put in the same place. Most people think this is a story about cheap Chinese labor. That explanation dies on contact with the object. A tourbillon is not a labor cost problem. It is 196 parts assembled and regulated by hand by people who take years to train. If wages were the variable, the gap would be 20%. It is closer to 400. The other assumption is that Chinese watches are copies. Some are. China is the world's largest producer of both real watches and fake ones. But in November 2025, at the Grand Prix d'Horlogerie de Genève, the industry's own annual prize, held in Geneva and judged by the Swiss trade, one of the top awards went to a biaxial tourbillon built by a Chinese manufacturer. Hold on to that detail, because the whole story turns on it. The mistake is thinking any of this is a question of who makes the better watch. That question barely matters. This is a story about who controls how many get made. To understand what broke, you have to understand what was built. And what was built rested on 3 things, none of which was craftsmanship. The first was the movement. Almost no Swiss brand makes its own. For most of the last century, they bought them from one supplier, ETA, which ended up inside the Swatch Group. In 2003, the Swiss Competition Commission opened an investigation after Swatch's Nicolas Hayek announced ETA would stop selling movements to companies outside the group. The regulator ordered it to keep supplying. In 2013, the two sides settled on a schedule. ETA could cut deliveries to third parties to 75% of its baseline from 2009 to 2011, in 2014 and 2015, to 65% in 2016 and 2017, and to 55% in 2018 and 2019. Read that sentence again. A national competition authority spent 16 years negotiating the rate at which one company was permitted to stop supplying its own competitors. The second was the words, "Swiss made is not a description, it is a legal test." The Federal Council adopted the current version in June 2016, and it came into force on the 1st of January 2017. It requires that at least 60% of the cost of manufacturing the watch is generated in Switzerland, which means the remaining 40% does not have to be. Research from ETH Zurich and the University of St. Gallen found buyers will pay 20 to 50% more for those 2 words on a dial. Then the story on top of the words. In 1996, the London agency Ligas Delaney wrote a line for Patek Philippe. "You never actually own a Patek Philippe, you merely look after it for the next generation." 30 years later, it still runs in more than 60 countries. That is not a description of a product. It is an instruction about behavior, and it is the same instruction De Beers gave the world with a diamond is forever. Do not sell it. Which conveniently means the second-hand market never competes with the new one. The third was allocation. Rolex publishes nothing, so the industry works from Morgan Stanley and Lux Consult estimates. On those numbers, Rolex built about 1.2 million watches in 2022 on wholesale revenue of roughly 11 billion Swiss francs, about a third of the entire Swiss watch industry by value. Demand at the popular references ran far past that. Dealers kept lists with no dates on them. And when the thing you want has no delivery date, it is not the boutique that sets the price. It is the man reselling it. For a while he set it very high. Patek's steel Nautilus 5711 had a list price of about $35,000. Between January 2018 and February 2022, that reference rose 465%, a gain of just under 154,000 euros on a single wristwatch, according to an analysis published by Quill and Pad. One large dealer's own transaction records showed the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak 15202 averaging $43,500 in 2019, $69,250 in 2021, and $105,750 in 2022. The steel Daytona, list price $14,800, averaged $35,250 in 2022, with one sale that year at $56,000. If you ever stood in front of a display case and were told there was a list, you were not experiencing scarcity. You were experiencing allocation. Then the money left. Rates rose, crypto fell, and the speculative bid went with it. Bloomberg's Subdial Index, which tracks the 50 most traded models, peaked in April 2022. By October 2023, it was down 42% from that peak, and the Patek Philippe component of it was down 47%. By March 2024, the Blue Dial 5711 traded at $98,753, roughly half its high. The index fell again across 2024 to a 3-year low. That is the story every business magazine ran, and it is true. A bubble inflated by stimulus money and punctured by interest rates. It is also only the visible half, because a country that stops buying something is only half a story. The other half is what it starts building while it is gone. Chinese watchmaking did not begin in 2022. The Tianjin watch factory was set up in January 1955 on a government order, and on the 24th of March that year, 4 men finished China's first wristwatch. In the early 1960s, the factory bought the tooling for a Swiss chronograph movement, the Venus Caliber 175, from Venus itself, an ordinary commercial sale, not a theft. Renamed the ST19, it is still in production 60 years later. Today, Seagull, as the company is now known, turns out between 2 and 3 million mechanical movements a year. Europa Star put its share of global automatic movement production at roughly a quarter as far back as 2007. But cost was never the interesting part. Capability was. In December 2024, the China Horologe Association listed, among the 10 most significant events in Chinese watchmaking that year, a single component, Seagull's own silicon hairspring, running inside a tourbillon. A silicon balanced spring is not decoration. It is the part that made high-end Swiss movements more accurate and effectively immune to magnetism, and it was close to the last piece of the technology stack Switzerland still genuinely owned. The watch it went into, the Seagull 8841, sells for $4,709. Set that against the Swiss floor. Tag Heuer's cheapest tourbillon, 14,900 francs. Frédéric Constant's, $15,695. Dandong's Central Tourbillon, $3,999. So here is the objection that ought to be forming. Why don't the Swiss simply refuse to sell them anything or out-engineer them? They can't do either, and the reason is a document they wrote themselves. On the 15th of July, 2020, the Swiss Competition Commission finished reconsidering ETA and declined to impose any further obligation to supply anyone. Its reasoning was that Sellita now offered comparable alternatives on price, quantity, and quality. In plain terms, the regulator declared the movement bottleneck open. At the exact moment the largest movement manufacturers outside Switzerland were already running at millions of units a year. The 60% rule cuts the same way. 40% of a Swiss-made watch's manufacturing cost may legally originate anywhere on Earth. A few brands say so out loud. 7 Friday, based in Zurich, prints a map on its casebacks. Design in Switzerland, movement in Japan, other components in China. Its founder Dan Niederer put it flatly, "The Chinese are very good at production processes." Meanwhile, the customer changed shape. Across the whole industry, in 2025, 14.6 million watches left Switzerland, 4.8% fewer than the year before. Morgan Stanley and Lux Consult counted 29 of the top 50 Swiss brands shrinking that year, 10 of them by 15% or more. Longines, Swatch, Hamilton, Blancpain, Breguet, Panerai, Roger Dubuis, Zenith, Gerard Perregaux, and Frank Muller. Longines fell 18% and dropped out of the Billion Franc Club. And now, the contradiction that tells you what actually survived. In that same collapsing year, watches priced above 50,000 francs made up 1.4% of the units Switzerland exported, and 37% of the value, and 89% of the industry's entire growth. The industry did not stop selling watches. It stopped selling the kind of watch somebody might one day resell. Be careful how far you push this, because the crash phase is over. On Morgan Stanley and Watch Charts data, secondary prices fell 10.7% in 2023 and 6.1% in 2024, then rose 4.9% across 2025, and another 1.9% in the first quarter of 2026. Swiss exports to mainland China were down only 5% in the first half of this year, and Hong Kong was up. But look at what recovery means here. In the first quarter of 2026, Cartier still traded 28% below retail on the secondary market, Omega 35%, Tudor 38%, IWC 39%. Rolex has raised list prices 4 years running, which mechanically lifts every used price underneath it. And the Chinese producers are not winning either. Seagull's revenue is a rounding error beside Rolex's 11 billion francs, and the manufacturer that won in Geneva makes fewer than a few hundred watches a year. So here is the answer to the question this opened with. What is collapsing is not Swiss watchmaking and not the price of watches. It is the resale premium, the belief that a steel sports watch is an asset, and that belief only ever existed because a handful of companies could control how many were made. China broke it from both ends at once. It withdrew the buyers who were paying the premium, and it removed the technical excuse for the bottleneck. No waiting list, because the movement supply is open. No resale premium, because the buyer who paid it went home. No mystery, because the hardest component in the watch is now made in Tianjin. Which brings back the detail from earlier. In November 2025, at the Grand Prix d'Horlogerie de Genève, the Audacity Prize went to the Mark I Mobius, a biaxial tourbillon from Femme Al Hout, a manufacturer in Shanghai that makes everything in its watches except the hairspring and the sapphire crystal. The same year, 2 more Chinese names, Barons and Atelier Wen, were finalists. The Swiss industry's own jury, in Geneva, handed a Chinese workshop the prize for audacity. Whether Rolex's prices are up or down next year almost doesn't matter now, because Rolex already gave you its answer. In December 2022, it launched a certified pre-owned program, buying used watches and reselling them through its own dealers with its own seal. In 2025, that business turned over somewhere between $514 and $594 million, more than a tenth of the entire Rolex resale market. The company whose value rested on you never selling now takes a margin when you do, and the pattern runs well past watches. In June 2024, a court in Milan placed Christian Dior's Italian manufacturing arm under judicial administration. The file described a handbag that cost €53 to produce and retailed for around $2,700. The subcontractors were Chinese-owned workshops, operating inside Italy. Armani's Italian unit had gone through the same process 2 months earlier. Same structure, different object. The premium lives in the label, the manufacturing lives somewhere else, and the moment somewhere else can sell to you directly, the number on the tag stops meaning anything. Nothing is scarce. Things are only allocated until someone else can make them. That's what this channel does. Take numbers that are already public and put them next to each other. If that's useful, subscribe. And in the comments, what's the last thing you bought where you're certain you were paying for the object and not for the queue?